Alan, I know that you have views on this, the way the pandemic is impacting in terms of our cohesion, not just globally, or rather not just as a nation, but also globally. And so it would be interesting to hear your take on pandemics and impact on the economies of the world. So over to you, Alan.
Thank you very much, Russell. It's great to be on a panel with Russell, who I met, well, got to know when he came back from studying in the UK in the 80s, and we played hockey together. And Iraj, who I overlapped with for a few years in the early 90s before he went off to the Standard Bank and I went off to work in government. So it's great. I think it's the first time we've been on a panel together. I want to share some of the conversations that I had with my students in the master's program at the Mandela School. At the Mandela School, we have a number of master's programs, and this is a module that we run with students from a range of departments on the practice of policymaking and implementation. And we, and I have to thank them for many of the interesting ideas that may come up in the course of this evening. We ended up talking quite a lot about the issue of cooperation and trust, because it turns out that in the practice of policymaking and implementation in this kind of an environment, cooperation and trust are incredibly important. It's very, very costly to be in a situation, and we'll talk more about it, where there's a lack of trust between countries, there's a lack of trust within international organizations, and there may be other areas where there are trust deficits which have to be built or rebuilt. Why is it so important? Well, let's talk about this event. Why is this event such a catastrophic event? And it is a catastrophic event in terms of health, although, perhaps not as bad as the Spanish flu, but it's pretty catastrophic. And why is it such a catastrophic event economically? And the reason is because we live in a world that is very interdependent. This is a predictable surprise. This surprise is not a black swan. It's what Taleb would probably call a white swan. It's something we could predict. Perhaps we couldn't have quite predicted the impact, but we certainly could have predicted that it was going to happen. In fact, it was predicted by Bill Gates and many other people over several, the last couple of decades. But it's catastrophic because of the interdependence of the world, globalization, communications, production, travel. We've become a very interdependent world, but we also have become a world which doesn't have real insurance policies. So we've moved many parts of the world in manufacturing and other industries to just-in-time production. So our inventories are very low. We don't have lots of goods in the stores because it costs money and it takes up space to keep those kinds of goods. So things can very quickly break down because of that interdependence and because of the low level of insurance that we've taken out. We've also taken out relatively low levels of insurance in terms of international cooperation around health issues. So how have we responded internationally? So I was working for President Mbeki and then Motlanthe and then Zuma briefly during the global financial crisis, and I experienced the unification really of the world around that issue. We had a G20 at that point, which was just a meeting of finance ministers. The President of the United States, who, if you recall, was actually George W. Bush, not the most perhaps highly respected of all American presidents, but certainly a president who was committed to international cooperation. And with his Secretary of the Treasury, they pulled a global summit together. That global summit produced a very high level of cooperation between the 20 largest economies, which included South Africa, and or the 20 most important systemic economies, and with the rest of the world. So we had a situation where the IMF was able to respond not only to draw on the quotas that governments had committed but hadn't put into the fund, but they were also able to issue special drawing rights to the value of about $283 billion in 2009, which is a big commitment to make for an organization. The World Bank got involved, other international institutions got involved, and the G20 for 2 or 3 years was an absolutely critically important instrument of global cooperation. Now today, with the G20 hasn't really met. There have been a couple of brief meetings of G20 leaders, but G20 is currently, in case you didn't know, under the leadership, it rotates, of Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is very close to the United States. They clearly haven't been encouraged by the United States to pull the G20 together as tightly as it could have been pulled together. And we haven't had this kind of response. In fact, the United States has blocked the issuing of special drawing rights by the IMF, which would have enabled more funds to be issued to help governments through these difficult times. So at the global level, we're definitely worse off than we should be. We also we talked about some of the regional institutions, the European Union, for example. European Union, for which I suppose there were very high expectations, perhaps unrealistically, because health in Europe is actually a national issue, not a regional issue. The expectations on the EU, though, quite high. They weren't able to respond, except with guidelines really in the health area. They certainly were able to establish what they called green lanes and protocols for inter-European travel. There were some funds established for European countries. So funds were basically reallocated within Europe to European countries and to developing countries. And the European Central Bank was basically took it upon itself to buy government bonds, European government bonds, which certainly helped some European countries which would have found it difficult to get buyers for their bonds or to sell their bonds at the kind of prices they wanted to sell their bonds at. So there were some significant achievements, but perhaps not at the level that was hoped for. The African Union, well, is a much less developed institution. It's not a full economic union yet. It's not anything like the level of political coordination that the EU has. So the expectations weren't very high, but actually it has performed relatively well. The African Union, the president of the Commission and the president of the AU, that's our president Ramaphosa, and Mr. Faku, who is the president of the chair of the Commission, have led an African engagement with international organizations around financial issues. In particular, President Ramaphosa has established a group of advisory group, which includes our former finance minister, Trevor Manuel, and a number of other distinguished Africans to engage internationally to get better financial support for Africa in these very difficult times. So that's been an achievement. Another interesting achievement has been in the Center for Disease Control. It was only set up 3 years ago in Africa, and it's been able to provide really useful advice, protocols, data, information that's helped African countries respond to the crisis. So African Union expectations weren't high, performance reasonably good. In South Africa, we've had a pretty good run. We've got a president whose popularity rating has grown from a relatively high level in the 60s to a very high level in the high 70s, possibly even higher in recent times, because of the authority that he has been able to stamp on the situation. My experience being in the President's Economic Advisory Council has been that the presidency has been open to conversations with a wide group of economists. So we've had several seminars where people from the trade unions and people from business and people from academia and other experts have been drawn into conversations about how to respond to how to understand the crisis and how to respond to the crisis. And those conversations continue. And that's the kind of tone which the presidency has tried to set. I think it's been a little spoiled, though, obviously, by the way that some of the arms of government, the police and the army, at least initially, didn't seem to understand their role very well. The engagement with non-governmental organizations has been a little disconcerting because of the level of cooperation that's really needed across the country. And I think also some of the regulations, I think it was referred to earlier, some of the regulations which have been set have made it very difficult for people, individuals, to understand what exactly is intended and where they've come from and why they've been put forward. So it's a well-led program, but it's had certain shaky elements. Now, as we move towards the phasing out the lockdown, moving down to lower levels, it becomes more and more important to have trust between individuals, trust within communities, trust between communities and their public officials, and trust at a national level between the key players nationally. So, you know, I expect and I hope that the president will be continuing to try to build that trust when he speaks later this evening.